I should have walked out that door the second I saw him. But something about the way he stood there made the world feel smaller, like the night itself had folded around him and left no space for me to breathe. The rain had just stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the streetlights, the air cool against my skin as I pushed open the back exit of the cafe, my sneakers sticking slightly to the damp concrete. My mind already halfway home thinking about a hot shower and maybe 6 hours of sleep if I was lucky. But then I saw the car, black, parked too close to the alleyway exit like it belonged there, like everything else didn't, and I slowed without meaning to, my hand still gripping the door behind me as if I could step back inside and undo whatever this moment was becoming. He was leaning against the driver's side, one shoulder resting casually like he had all the time in the world, dressed in a dark suit that didn't belong in an alley behind a place that sold $5 coffee and day-old pastries. And he didn't look up right away, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he already knew I was there. I told myself to walk. Just walk. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. But I didn't. I looked straight at him, and the second our eyes met, something shifted, not outside, not in the alley, but inside me, like a quiet warning I didn't know how to listen to. His gaze didn't move, didn't soften. It held, steady and certain, like he was reading something written under my skin, and suddenly the space between us didn't feel like 6 feet anymore. It felt like nothing. I took a step forward anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? Stand there all night pretending I wasn't being watched? But the moment I got close enough to pass, he moved, just one step, just enough, and it was subtle, almost polite, except it wasn't, because now there was no way around him. My heart picked up, not fast, not panicked, just enough to remind me I was no longer in control of this moment, and I hated that feeling more than anything. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice steady, because I refused to let it shake, refused to give him that, but he didn't move. Not immediately. His eyes dropped for a second, taking in details I hadn't offered, the damp sleeve of my jacket, the loose strand of hair stuck to my cheek, the way my fingers tightened around my bag strap, and then he looked back at me, and there it was, something unreadable, something that made my chest feel tight for reasons I couldn't explain. "Dinner," he said, his voice low, calm, like we were already in the middle of a conversation I hadn't agreed to. I blinked, sure I'd misheard him, but he continued, same tone, same certainty, "Tomorrow, 8 p.m. A pause, just long enough for me to realize he wasn't asking. "Don't be late." My brows pulled together before I could stop them. "I'm not going," I said, and this time my voice did come out sharper, because I needed it to, needed to push something back into place inside me that had shifted the moment he stepped in my way. For a second, nothing happened. He didn't react the way men usually did when they were told no. No frustration, no amusement, just a quiet stillness, like he was adjusting something invisible. Then, the faintest hint of something touched his expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me like I had just proven a point he already believed. "Stubborn girl," he said, softer now, almost thoughtful, like he was deciding something about me I hadn't agreed to share, and before I could respond, before I could argue or step back or do anything that felt like mine, he shifted again, just enough to clear the path, just enough to let me pass. And that should have been it. That should have been the end of it. But as I walked past him, every step suddenly too loud in the quiet alley, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, cold and steady, that I hadn't just walked away from him. I had walked into something I didn't understand yet. I told myself it meant nothing as I walked the rest of the way home, my steps quick at first, and then slower as the quiet of the street settled back into something almost normal, like the night was trying to erase him from it. But it did not work, because every few seconds my mind replayed the way he had said it, not loud, not aggressive, just certain, like time itself had already agreed with him, and I was the only one out of place. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building that smelled faintly like old paint and someone else's cooking, and usually that smell grounded me, reminded me that my life was small and mine and predictable, but tonight it felt different, like I had brought something unfamiliar back with me without meaning to. I locked the door, checked it twice, then leaned against it for a second longer than necessary, listening to the silence inside my own space as if I expected it to answer me, but it did not, So I pushed myself away and moved through my routine, dropping my bag on the chair, kicking off my shoes, running my hands through my hair as I headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. Except even that felt off, like I was going through motions that no longer belonged to the same version of me who had walked into that alley an hour ago. I kept thinking about how easily he had moved, how little effort it took for him to change the direction of my night, and I hated that I could not explain why it bothered me so much. Because it was not fear, not exactly. It was something quieter, something that felt like losing control before I even understood what I had lost. I barely slept, and when I did, it was light and restless, filled with fragments of that moment. The way his eyes had stayed on me, the way he had not needed to raise his voice, the way the word stubborn had sounded less like an insult and more like a decision he had already made about me. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Just a strange encounter that would fade the moment real life took over again. So I got dressed, tied my hair back, and headed to work like I always did, the familiar rhythm of the cafe pulling me back into something steady, something safe, the hum of conversation, the smell of coffee, the sound of cups against counters, all of it wrapping around me like a shield I did not realize I needed until now. "Emily, you are late," my manager called from behind the register, not angry, just tired, and I nodded, forcing a small smile as I slipped into place, grabbing an apron and tying it around my waist, letting the normalcy of it settle into my bones, because this was my world, not his, not whatever that alley had been trying to turn into. For a while, it worked. Orders came in, I moved, I focused, I kept my head down and my thoughts contained, until around noon when something shifted again, subtle at first. Just a glance from a customer that lingered a second too long, then another, and then I noticed the man sitting near the window, not drinking his coffee, not looking at his phone, just watching, not in a way that felt inappropriate, just attentive, like he was waiting for something that had not happened yet. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was letting one strange night bleed into everything else. But then my manager called me over, his expression different now, more careful, like he was choosing his words before he spoke them. "There was a delivery for you," he said, sliding a small box across the counter toward me. No return address, no name except mine written in clean, precise lettering that made my stomach tighten in a way I could not ignore. I stared at it for a second, longer than I should have, aware of the room around me without really hearing it, aware of the way my fingers hesitated before touching the edge of the box, like opening it would confirm something I was not ready to admit. "You going to open that?" he asked, half curious, half distracted, and I nodded slowly, because not opening it felt worse somehow, like pretending it did not exist would not make it disappear. The lid came off easily, no resistance, and inside was a dress, simple, elegant, nothing flashy, but unmistakably expensive in a way that did not need to announce itself. The fabric smooth under my fingertips, the color deep and soft like it had been chosen with intention, and beneath it, a card, just one line written in the same precise hand. 8 p.m. I did not need a name to know who it was from, and for a moment, everything around me faded again, the cafe, the noise, the people, all of it slipping into the background as that same quiet realization settled in my chest, heavier now, harder to ignore, that nothing about last night had been accidental, not the timing, not the words, not the way he had stepped aside just enough to let me think I had a choice, because standing there, holding that dress, I understood something I had not wanted to understand before. This was not an invitation I could simply forget. This was a moment that had already moved forward without me, and whether I liked it or not, it was waiting for me to catch up. I did not touch the dress again for the rest of my shift, but I felt it there the entire time, like it had weight even when it was not in my hands, like it had already been placed somewhere inside my day where I could not ignore it. And every time I tried to focus on something normal, a customer order, the sound of milk steaming, the rhythm of cups lining up on the counter, my mind slipped back to that single line written on the card. The way it did not explain anything, did not ask anything. It just existed, certain and waiting. By the time my shift ended, the sky had already turned that soft gray blue that meant evening was settling in, and I stood in the small staff room longer than necessary, staring at the box sitting on the bench in front of me, my fingers resting against the edge like I was deciding whether it belonged to me or not. because accepting it felt like stepping into something I did not understand. But ignoring it felt like pretending something very real was not already moving around me. I told myself I could just go home, lock the door, turn off my phone, let the night pass like any other. But even as I thought it, I knew it would not work, because this was not about the dress, or the dinner, or even him standing in that alley. It was about the way everything had shifted without asking me. The way my choices suddenly felt smaller than they had the day before. I picked up the box before I could overthink it, carried it home with me like it was something fragile, even though it did not feel fragile at all. And when I got inside my apartment, I set it down on my bed and just stood there for a moment, looking at it like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. It did not. Nothing about this explained itself. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding and reached for the dress again, pulling it free from the box and holding it up in the dim light of my room, the fabric catching just enough of it to show its shape, simple, clean, nothing excessive, which somehow made it feel more intentional, like it had been chosen for me specifically, not just sent. I ran my fingers along the sleeve, the stitching, the way it fit together, and something about that detail unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant someone had taken the time to know what would suit me, what I would not immediately reject, and that thought settled deep, quiet, and uncomfortable. I should not go, I said out loud, the words sounding small in the silence of my apartment, like they were not strong enough to hold their ground. And I knew that tone. I knew that hesitation. It was the same feeling I had standing in that alley, the same awareness that this was not entirely in my control anymore. I checked the time without meaning to, 6:30, and the number hit me harder than it should have, because it meant I was already thinking about it, already measuring my evening against something I claimed I was not going to do. I turned away from the dress, pacing the small space between my bed and the window, my reflection catching in the glass as the city lights flickered on outside, each one steady and distant, each one belonging to someone else's life that had not been interrupted by a stranger who spoke like decisions were already made. I tried to imagine not going, tried to picture what that would look like, but every version of it felt incomplete, like I was skipping a step in something that had already begun, and that thought frustrated me more than anything else, because I did not like the idea that my story could move forward without my permission. I stopped pacing and looked back at the dress again, really looked this time, not as something sent to me, but as something waiting, and the realization came quietly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady and clear, that this was not about whether I wanted to go. It was about whether I was willing to face whatever came next by pretending it was not there or by stepping into it on my own terms. 7:15. I moved before I could change my mind, picking up the dress again, not rushing, not hesitating, just deciding. And as I did, that same feeling from the alley returned, not fear, not exactly, something sharper, something that felt like standing on the edge of something unknown and realizing that staying still was not going to keep me safe. Because whatever this was, whatever he had set in motion with a few quiet words and a single look, it had not ended when he stepped aside and let me walk away. It had only given me the illusion that I had. I did not rush, and that was the strangest part, because every instinct in me said this moment should feel urgent, like I was running towards something or away from it. But instead, everything felt slowed down, deliberate, like time itself had decided to watch what I would do next. The dress fit like it had been waiting for me, not tight, not loose, just exact, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant someone had anticipated me in a way I had not agreed to be understood. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have, studying my own reflection like I was trying to recognize a version of myself that had not existed yesterday. The same face, the same eyes, but something quieter had shifted beneath it, something that knew this night was not ordinary no matter how much I tried to pretend it could be. 7:45. I grabbed my coat, my phone, my keys, moving through the motions without overthinking them because I had already learned that thinking too much only made this feel less like a choice. The city outside was alive in that familiar way, headlights stretching down the street, people passing by with their own lives unfolding in directions that had nothing to do with mine. And for a second I envied that. The simplicity of it, the anonymity of being just another person heading home or meeting friends or living a night that did not come with an invisible weight attached to it. I walked 2 blocks before I realized I was early, not by accident, but because some part of me had already adjusted, already aligned itself with a time I had insisted I would ignore, and that realization made me stop for half a second on the sidewalk, my breath catching in a way I did not expect, because it meant this was no longer just happening around me. I was participating in it. The restaurant was not hidden, not secret, just quietly expensive in a way that did not need to announce itself. Soft lighting behind large windows, people inside speaking in low tones, everything controlled and calm. And as I stood across the street looking at it, I felt that same shift again, the one from the alley, the one that made everything narrow down to a single point of decision. I could still walk away. That thought came clearly, firmly, and I held on to it for a moment, testing it, turning it over like it might still be true. But even as I stood there, I knew walking away would not reset anything. It would not erase the dress, or the card, or the way my day had bent around a time I had not chosen. It would only delay whatever this was becoming. I crossed the street. The door opened before I reached for it. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, just smoothly, like someone had been expecting me. And that small detail sent a quiet ripple through me that I could not ignore. Inside, the air was warmer, softer, the kind of place where everything felt intentional, from the spacing of the tables to the way the staff moved without rushing. And for a second I hesitated near the entrance, aware of how out of place I should have felt and how strangely I did not. A hostess stepped forward, her expression polite, composed, but there was something else there, recognition, not of me as a person, but of me as someone who was supposed to be here. "This way," she said gently, already turning before I answered, and I followed without questioning it, because at this point, questioning felt like pretending I had not already made the decision to step inside. We moved through the room, past conversations and quiet laughter, past people who did not look up, who did not notice me, and yet I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with them, a steady awareness that had been there since the alley and had not left me since. The table was near the back, not hidden, but placed in a way that felt separate, deliberate, and he was already there. Of course he was, sitting as if he had been there all along, as if time had started when he arrived and everything else was just catching up. Adrian did not stand immediately, did not rush, just looked at me the same way he had the night before, steady, certain, like my arrival had confirmed something he had never doubted. I stopped a few feet from the table, not sitting yet, not moving closer, holding on to that small distance like it still belonged to me. And for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional rather than awkward. "You came," he said finally, his voice low, calm, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging something inevitable, and I felt something in my chest tighten at that word, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it, like it had never been a question at all. I held his gaze for a second longer than I should have, just long enough to remind myself that I had chosen to walk in here on my own, that whatever this was, it was not going to take that from me. And then I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, slow, controlled, refusing to let the weight of his certainty rush me into anything I did not decide for myself. "I was in the neighborhood," I said, knowing it sounded weak the moment it left my mouth, because we both knew that was not true, and the faintest shift in his expression told me he knew it too. Not mocking, not dismissive, just aware, like he expected nothing less than a partial truth from me at this stage. He did not call it out. He did not need to. Instead, he gestured slightly toward the table, a quiet motion, and a server appeared almost instantly, placing a glass of water in front of me without asking, without hesitation, as if the entire evening had already been arranged down to the smallest detail. I noticed that. Of course I did. The way no one interrupted him, the way no one asked questions, the way everything flowed around him without resistance. And it clicked into place with a clarity that made my chest feel tight. This was not just confidence. This was control, the kind that did not need to be proven because it already existed in every corner of the room. "You planned this," I said, my voice lower now, less defensive, more certain, because I needed to understand the rules of whatever game I had stepped into. His eyes flicked to mine, steady, unhurried. "I arranged a dinner," he replied, the same calm tone, the same precise choice of words, and there it was again, that distinction, not planned, not forced, arranged, like he was placing pieces on a board that only he could see clearly. I leaned back slightly in my chair, crossing my arms without thinking, creating distance in the only way I still could. "And you always get what you arrange?" I asked, holding his gaze, testing something I could not fully define. For the first time, something almost like amusement touched his expression, subtle, controlled, but real enough that I caught it. "Not always," he said, and then after a brief pause, "but I do not arrange things I am uncertain about." The words settled between us, not heavy, not threatening, just clear, and I felt that same internal shift again, that awareness that he was not trying to intimidate me. He did not need to. He was simply stating something he believed to be true. I looked down at the table for a second, at the neatly folded napkin, the polished silverware, the details that suddenly felt too precise to be accidental, and then back at him. "You do not know me," I said, more quietly now, because this was the part that mattered. This was the line I needed to hold. His gaze did not waver. "I know enough," he replied, and the way he said it was not dismissive, it was not arrogant, it was observational, like he had already gathered what he needed from the way I walked, the way I spoke, the way I had looked at him in that alley instead of looking away. That unsettled me more than anything else, not because it felt invasive, but because part of me recognized it, the accuracy of being seen in a way I had not offered. "You assume a lot," I said, but there was less resistance in my voice now, less sharpness, and I hated that he might hear that shift. He tilted his head slightly, studying me again, not pressing, not closing the distance, just watching. "You came," he said simply, and it was not a question, not even a statement. It was a conclusion, one that made everything else feel secondary. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to explain, but the words did not come as easily this time, because he was not wrong, and that was the part that unsettled me the most. I had come, not because I was forced, not because I had no choice, but because something in me had decided to step into this moment instead of walking away from it. The server returned, placing menus on the table, but Adrian did not look at his, did not need to, and I realized then that this dinner, this entire evening, it was not about the food, or the place, or even the pretense of a normal interaction. It was about this conversation, this space where he could observe and wait and let me realize things on my own. "You are still deciding," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful, and I looked up at him, my brows pulling together slightly. "Deciding what?" I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer. His gaze held mine, steady, patient. "Whether you are here because of me," he said, "or because of yourself." The words landed quietly, but they stayed, echoing in a way I could not ignore, because they shifted the question entirely, away from him, away from control, and back onto me, onto my own choices, my own reasons, and for the first time since I had stepped into that alley, I was not sure which answer unsettled me more. I did not answer him right away because I did not like the direction that question pulled me in, not toward him, but inward, towards something I had been carefully avoiding since the moment I saw that black car in the alley, and I felt it now, that quiet pressure of truth building behind my ribs, waiting for me to either admit it or run from it. I looked down at the menu in front of me, even though I was not reading a single word, my fingers brushing against the edge of the paper just to ground myself in something physical, something ordinary, but even that felt distant, like normal had stepped back and was watching me from far away. "I came because I wanted to understand what this is," I said finally, my voice steady enough to pass, even if it did not feel that way inside. And when I looked up, his eyes were already on me, not surprised, not impressed, just listening in a way that made every word feel like it mattered more than it should. "And do you?" he asked, not challenging, not pushing, just asking as if the answer belonged entirely to me. I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "No," I admitted, because pretending otherwise felt pointless at this stage, and something about saying it out loud made the tension in my chest shift, not disappear, but change, like I had stepped 1 inch closer to something real whether I liked it or not. He nodded once, slow, thoughtful, like that answer aligned with something he already knew, and then, instead of pressing further, he reached for his glass, taking a measured sip, giving me space that did not feel like distance but like intention, like he was allowing the moment to settle rather than controlling it. That confused me more than anything else. I had expected pressure, expected him to close in on the conversation the way he had closed the distance in that alley. But he did not, and that absence of force made everything feel sharper, more deliberate. You do not force things, I said, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway, his gaze shifting slightly as if I had just said something worth noting. Force is inefficient, he replied simply, setting the glass back down with a quiet precision. People resist it. They break away from it. His eyes held mine then, steady, unblinking. Choice, he continued, softer now, is much stronger. The words settled between us, heavier than it should have been, because it reframed everything. The dress, the note, the timing, even this conversation, not as something imposed on me, but as something I had stepped into, piece by piece, without fully realizing it. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together in my lap, holding onto that small sense of control as tightly as I could. You make it sound like this was all my idea, I said, my tone sharper again, because I needed that edge, needed to remind both of us that I was not just going to accept his version of things without question. A faint smile touched his lips, not mocking, not dismissive, just acknowledging the tension I was holding on to. Not your idea, he said, but your decision. The distinction was subtle, but it landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because it removed him from responsibility in a way that felt almost unfair, and yet I could not deny the truth buried inside it. I had walked into the restaurant. I had opened the box. I had put on the dress. No one had physically made me do any of it. And that realization unsettled me in a way that control alone never could. The server returned, asking quietly if we were ready to order, and Adrian answered without hesitation, selecting dishes with the same calm certainty he had used all night, not asking for my input, not because he dismissed it, but because he already knew what he was going to do, and strangely, I did not interrupt him, did not correct him. I just listened, aware of the shift happening inside me even as I resisted it. When the server left, the silence returned, but it felt different now, less like a standoff and more like something unfolding at its own pace. Why me? I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it had been sitting there since the beginning, unspoken but constant, and I needed to hear his answer even if I was not sure I would believe it. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not dangerously, just focused. Because you looked at me, he said, and for a second I thought I had misheard him, because the answer was too simple, too small compared to everything that had happened since. That is it? I asked, disbelief slipping into my voice despite myself. He held my gaze, unwavering. Most people do not, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just fact, just observation. They look away. They lower their eyes. They choose distance. A pause. You did not. The memory hit me then, clear and immediate. The alley, the rain, the moment I had met his eyes instead of avoiding them, and I felt something shift again, something deeper this time, because it meant this entire chain of events. This night, this conversation, it had not started with him stepping into my path. It had started with me refusing to step out of his. I felt the weight of his words settle deeper than I wanted them to, not because they were dramatic or overwhelming, but because they were simple, and simplicity has a way of cutting through every excuse you try to build around it. I looked at him for a moment longer, really looked this time, not at the suit or the composed posture or the quiet authority that seemed to follow him without effort, but at the stillness in him, the kind that does not come from calm, but from control, and I realized something I had not admitted yet. He was not trying to change me. He was waiting to see what I would do next. That does not mean anything, I said. But even as I spoke, the words felt thinner than before, like they did not carry the same certainty they would have a day ago. He did not argue. He did not correct me. He simply watched, and somehow that was worse, because it meant the burden of proof was mine now, not his. The plates arrived, set down with quiet precision, the conversation pausing just long enough for the moment to reset. But nothing about it actually changed. The air between us still held that same tension, not sharp, not aggressive, just present, like something unresolved that neither of us was willing to ignore. I picked up my fork, more for something to do than out of hunger, taking a small bite without tasting it, My attention split between the normal act of eating and the awareness that nothing about this night was normal. You keep saying it like I chose this, I said after a moment, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more curious despite myself, because I needed to understand how he saw this, how he could sit there so certain. While I was still trying to find the edges of what was happening, he leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxed, not careless, just composed in a way that made every movement feel intentional. You did, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just a statement that did not need to be reinforced. I shook my head slightly, a reflex more than anything else. You showed up in that alley, I countered. You sent the dress, the note, you set all of this up. My hand gestured vaguely around the table, the restaurant, the entire carefully constructed evening. That is not exactly leaving me a lot of room. For the first time, his expression shifted in a way that felt almost like acknowledgement, not agreement, but recognition of the point I was making. I created an opportunity, he said, his voice even, measured. You decided to step into it. I let out a breath, slower this time, because arguing in circles was not going to get me anywhere, and part of me was starting to realize that he was not trying to win anything here. He was simply letting me arrive at something on my own. That thought unsettled me more than any direct pressure could have. And if I had not come? I asked, watching him closely, because this was the part that mattered. This was where I needed to see if there was a line, if there was a limit to whatever this control of his really was. He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, like he was choosing the exact shape of the truth he was about to give me. Then we would not be here, he said finally, simple, direct, and for a second I searched his face for anything else, any hint of something unspoken, but there was nothing, just that same steady certainty. You would have just let it go? I pressed, unable to stop myself, because that answer felt too clean, too easy compared to everything I had experienced since that night. His gaze held mine, unwavering. I do not chase things that choose to walk away, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made me believe him, not because it sounded convincing, but because it aligned with everything else about him, the control, the restraint, the way he did not force, did not rush, did not need to. That realization shifted something again, something subtle but important, because it meant this entire situation was not built on pressure the way I had assumed. It was built on presence, on timing, on the quiet confidence that I would step forward on my own. I looked down at my plate again, my appetite gone completely now, replaced by something else, something sharper, more focused, like I was starting to see the shape of this interaction more clearly. You are very sure of yourself, I said, not accusing, just stating what had become impossible to ignore. He tilted his head slightly, considering that. No, he said after a moment, and that single word caught me off guard more than anything else he had said all night. I am very sure of what I see. His eyes met mine again, steady, unflinching, and for a second, everything else faded, the restaurant, the noise, the distance between us, all of it narrowing down to that one point of connection that I had chosen in the alley and had not fully understood until now. And what do you see? I asked quietly, because I needed to hear it, even if I was not sure I was ready for the answer. He did not look away. Someone who does not follow, he said, but does not walk away either. The words settled into me slowly, not as a compliment, not as a claim, but as something closer to recognition. And for the first time since this night began, I felt something shift in a way I had not expected, not resistance, not fear, but awareness, because if he was right, if even part of that was true, then this was not just about him choosing me. It was about me standing still long enough for him to notice. His words did not feel like a compliment, and that was what made them stay, not flattering, not exaggerated, just placed in front of me like something I had to either accept or reject, and I realized I did not know which one I wanted to do. I looked down for a second, not because I was avoiding him, but because I needed to step back from that clarity, from the way he seemed to see straight through the layers I usually kept between myself and the rest of the world. I had always thought of myself as careful, as someone who knew when to walk away, when to keep distance, when to stay unnoticed, but now, sitting across from him, I was starting to question that, because if that had been true, I would not be here. I would have kept my head down in that alley. I would have ignored the box. I would have stayed home. But I had not. And that was not something he had done. That was something I had chosen, step by step, even when I told myself I was not choosing anything at all. You make it sound like I am predictable, I said, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more thoughtful, because I was no longer trying to push back as much as I was trying to understand where I stood in this. He watched me for a moment. That same steady attention that never felt rushed, never felt impatient, like he was willing to wait as long as it took for me to reach my own conclusions. No, he said finally, predictable people do not interest me. The words were simple, but they shifted something again, not in a dramatic way, just enough to change the direction of my thoughts, because it meant this was not about control in the way I had first assumed. It was about something else, something more precise, more selective. I let that sit for a second, then leaned back slightly in my chair, exhaling slowly as I looked around the restaurant, taking in the quiet conversations, the low lighting, the way everything felt contained within its own boundaries, and I realized something that made my chest tighten just slightly. This place, this entire environment, it reflected him, controlled, composed, intentional, nothing out of place, nothing accidental. Everything around you feels like that, I said, gesturing faintly to the space, like it is already decided before anyone else steps into it. He followed my gaze briefly, then looked back at me, and there was a slight shift in his expression, not disagreement, not correction, just acknowledgement. I prefer clarity, he said, and there was something about the way he said it that made it sound less like preference and more like a rule he lived by. I nodded slowly, because I could see that now, I could feel it in every part of this evening. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching again, but it no longer felt like tension, it felt like space, like something that allowed the conversation to breathe instead of pushing it forward. The food sat mostly untouched in front of me, and I realized I had stopped pretending to eat entirely, my attention fully on him now, on this interaction that had somehow become more important than anything else happening around us. What happens after this? I asked suddenly, the question coming out before I could filter it, because it had been building quietly in the background of everything else, and now it felt impossible to ignore. His eyes held mine, steady, unreadable for a moment, and then he leaned forward slightly, just enough to close a fraction of the distance between us, not invading, not overwhelming, just present in a way that made the air feel more focused. That depends on you, he said, and there it was again, that shift, that refusal to take control in the way I expected, that insistence on placing the next step back in my hands even while everything around me suggested otherwise. I frowned slightly, not out of frustration, but because I could see the pattern now, the way he moved, the way he spoke, always leading, but never pushing, always setting the stage, but never forcing the scene to play out in one specific way. You keep doing that, I said quietly, studying him. You set everything up, and then you act like I am the one deciding. His gaze did not waver. You are, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no need to explain further, because from his perspective, it was already obvious. I shook my head slightly, a small, almost disbelieving motion, but I could feel something shifting again, something deeper this time, because the more we spoke, the harder it became to hold on to the idea that I was simply reacting to him, because every step I traced back led to a moment where I had chosen not to walk away. I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, I did not see just control or confidence or power. I saw something else underneath it, something quieter, something that felt less like domination and more like certainty, and that distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. And if I decide to leave? I asked, my voice steady again, testing that boundary one more time, because I needed to know if it still existed. He did not move, did not reach, did not even lean closer. Then you leave, he said, simple, direct, and there was no challenge in it, no hidden threat, just a statement that stood on its own. I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something behind it, something that would contradict what he was saying, but there was nothing, just that same steady presence, that same quiet control that did not need to prove itself. And that was when it settled fully, not all at once, but enough that I could not ignore it anymore. This was not a trap in the way I had feared. It was something else entirely, something built on the idea that I would stay, not because I had to, but because I chose to, and that realization was far more unsettling than anything else he could have done. I should have stood up right then, taken that opening he gave me, and walked out just to prove that I could, just to remind myself that I was still in control of something in this situation, but I did not move, and the longer I stayed still, the more that fact settled into me in a way I could not ignore. I looked at him across the table, really looked this time without trying to frame him as something I needed to resist, and that changed everything in a way I had not expected, because when I stopped seeing him as a force I had to push against, I started seeing the space he was giving me, the way he was not closing in, not rushing, not demanding anything from me except honesty. And that realization made the ground under my assumptions shift again. "You are very calm about this," I said after a moment, my voice quieter now, less sharp, because I was no longer trying to challenge him as much as I was trying to understand him. He did not react immediately, just watched me with that same steady attention, like he was letting me find my way through my own thoughts before he added anything to them. "There is no reason not to be," he said finally, simple, controlled. And for a second I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how completely different his perspective was from mine, how something that felt so complicated and uncertain to me could feel so clear and contained to him. I leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as I let my eyes drift for a moment, taking in the quiet rhythm of the restaurant again, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, everything continuing around us like nothing unusual was happening. And yet it felt like I was sitting in the center of something that had shifted far beyond this table. "You really think this is simple?" I said, more to myself than to him, but he answered anyway. "It is," he said, and when I looked back at him, there was no arrogance in it, no attempt to convince me, just a calm certainty that did not depend on my agreement. I shook my head slightly, a small, almost automatic motion, because nothing about this felt simple to me, not the way I had been drawn into it, not the way my own choices had started to feel less like reactions and more like decisions I could not fully explain. "It does not feel simple," I admitted, and that felt like the most honest thing I had said all night. He nodded once, acknowledging that without trying to correct it. "Because you are still deciding what it means," he said, and that landed differently than everything else, not as a statement about him, but about me, about the way I was trying to define this in terms that made sense in my world. I looked at him for a long second, studying the way he sat there, completely at ease, not because he was relaxed, but because he was certain, and I realized that certainty was the real difference between us, not power, not control, but clarity, the kind that did not need to question itself. "And you already decided?" I asked, my voice steady again, because if we were going to be honest, then I needed to understand where he stood as clearly as he seemed to understand me. His gaze did not waver. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of that answer made something in my chest tighten slightly, not in fear, but in awareness, because it meant I was the only one still, standing in the middle of a question. I let out a slow breath, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as I grounded myself again in something real, something present, because the conversation had started to feel like it existed somewhere just beneath the surface of everything else. "What did you decide?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no attempt to soften it, because I needed to hear it directly, without interpretation. He leaned forward just slightly, not closing the distance enough to overwhelm, just enough to make the moment feel more focused, more intentional. "That you would not walk away," he said, and the words landed with a quiet weight that echoed through me in a way I was not prepared for, because they were not framed as hope or expectation. They were framed as fact. I held his gaze, my pulse steady but louder in my awareness now, because this was the point where I either accepted that or challenged it, and I could feel both options pulling at me in equal measure. "You do not know that," I said, but even as I spoke, I could hear the difference in my own voice, the lack of conviction that had been there earlier, the way the argument felt thinner now that I had traced my own steps back to every moment I could have left and did not. He did not interrupt. Did not argue, just watched, and that silence pushed me further than any words could have, because it left me alone with the truth of what I had done, not what he had arranged, not what had been set in motion, but what I had chosen in response to it. I looked down for a second, then back at him, and for the first time since this began, I felt something settle into place, not a conclusion, not a surrender, but an acknowledgement that this was not something happening to me. It was something I was actively part of, and that realization shifted the entire balance of the night. "And if I am still deciding?" I asked quietly, because that was the only honest place I had left to stand. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly, just enough to register. "Then you are exactly where you need to be," he said, and that answer did not trap me, did not push me forward. It simply met me where I was, and for the first time, that felt more powerful than anything else he had done. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence no longer felt like something I needed to fill. It felt like something I was allowed to sit in, something that did not rush me toward an answer I was not ready to give. And that alone changed the way I looked at him, not as someone pulling me forward, but as someone who had already accepted that I would move when I decided to. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing just slightly without me meaning to, and I realized how tense I had been since the moment I stepped into that alley, how every second since had felt like a quiet negotiation between holding on to control and trying to understand what I was stepping into. "You are very patient," I said, my voice softer now, less guarded, because that was the truth that had become impossible to ignore. He did not respond right away, his gaze steady, thoughtful, like he was considering the word rather than accepting it. "I do not rush outcomes," he said finally, and that phrasing caught my attention more than the sentiment itself, because it implied something deeper, something intentional, like everything he did was part of a larger timeline that did not need to be forced into place. I nodded slowly, letting that settle, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing on the defensive side of this conversation. I felt like I was inside it, part of it, and that shift was subtle but undeniable. I glanced down at my hands, resting lightly on the table, and then back at him. "And what outcome are you not rushing right now?" I asked, the question coming out more naturally than I expected, because it no longer felt like I was trying to challenge him. It felt like I was trying to understand the shape of something I was already standing in. His expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, something more focused, more present. "You deciding to stay?" he said, and the words landed quietly, without emphasis, without pressure, just placed between us like a fact that did not need to be proven. I held his gaze, not looking away this time, not breaking that connection the way I might have earlier, because now I understood that looking away would not change anything. It would only delay the moment I was already in. "And if I do not?" I asked, not because I needed to argue, but because I needed to hear the full shape of this from him, needed to know that the option was real and not just something he said to maintain control. He did not hesitate. "Then you leave," he said, the same calm certainty as before, and there was still no tension in it, no attempt to sway me one way or the other, just a statement that existed without needing reinforcement. I studied him for a second longer, searching for something behind that answer, something that would reveal a contradiction, but there was nothing, just that same steady presence that had not changed since the beginning. And that was when it clicked in a way it had not before, not gradually, not subtly, but clearly enough that I could not ignore it. He was not controlling me. He was controlling the environment, the timing, the space around me, but the decisions inside that space were still mine, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. I leaned back slightly, my breath steady now, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligning into something clearer, something I could finally hold on to. "You knew I would come," I said, not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement of what had become obvious. His gaze remained on me, unwavering. "Yes," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften it, just the same quiet certainty that had been there from the start. I let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a quiet laugh, because I could see it now, the pattern, the way everything had unfolded, not by force, not by pressure, but by understanding, by reading me in a way I had not expected anyone to. "That is a dangerous kind of confidence," I said, my voice calm, because I was no longer reacting, I was observing, seeing him for what he was rather than what I had assumed. A faint smile touched his lips, not defensive, not dismissive, just acknowledging the truth in what I had said. "Only if it is wrong," he replied, and that answer settled into me in a way that felt heavier than it should have, because it meant his certainty was not blind, it was calculated, based on something he believed he understood clearly. I looked at him for a long second, then glanced around the restaurant again. The quiet, controlled environment, the way everything seemed to move without friction, and I realized something that shifted everything one last time. This was not just about him understanding me. It was about him creating a space where I would understand myself more clearly too. I turned back to him, my gaze steady now, not resisting, not surrendering, just present. "And if I stay?" I asked, the question simple, direct, because I was no longer circling around it. I was stepping into it. His expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of an answer he had been waiting to give. "Then we continue," he said, and those words did not define anything, did not lock me into a path. They simply opened one. And for the first time since this began, that felt less like a loss of control and more like the start of something I was choosing to understand. The word "continue" did not feel like an answer. It felt like a doorway, and I sat there for a second longer than I needed to, letting it settle, letting myself feel the weight of what that actually meant, not in some abstract way, but here, now, in this exact moment where I still had the option to stand up and walk away and choose a completely different ending to this night. But I did not move. I did not reach for my coat or my bag or even shift in my seat. I stayed exactly where I was, and that stillness felt louder than anything I could have said out loud. He did not react to it immediately, did not acknowledge it with words, but I saw it in the way his gaze remained steady, in the way nothing about him changed, because from his perspective, nothing had needed to. I had already made the only decision that mattered. "You are very sure I will not regret this," I said after a moment, my voice quieter now, not because I was unsure, but because the question itself felt more real than anything I had asked before. He considered that, not dismissing it, not brushing it aside, and that pause mattered, because it meant he was not going to give me an easy answer just to keep me here. "Regret is usually about what you did not understand at the time," he said finally, his tone measured, thoughtful. "You are asking questions. That reduces the risk." I let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a quiet acknowledgement, because that was not reassurance, not in the way I might have expected. It was something else, something more grounded, and I realized that was consistent with everything else about him. He did not promise outcomes, he defined conditions. I glanced down at the table, then back at him. "And what is it that I am stepping into?" I asked, because if I was going to stay, if I was going to continue, then I needed more than vague answers. I needed something real to hold on to. His eyes did not leave mine. "A conversation that does not end tonight," he said, and there was something about that phrasing that made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from awareness, because it implied continuity, something extending beyond this controlled environment, beyond this single evening where everything had been arranged down to the smallest detail. I nodded slowly, taking that in, letting it settle, because this was the first time he had pointed beyond the present moment, and that mattered. "And you think I will agree to that?" I said, not as a challenge, but as a question I genuinely needed answered. His expression remained composed, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something that felt almost like certainty reinforced rather than questioned. "You already have," he replied, and that landed in a way that made my thoughts pause for a second, because he was not referring to anything verbal, not to a promise or a commitment. He was referring to my presence, to the fact that I was still sitting here, still engaged, still asking instead of leaving. I leaned back slightly, absorbing that, tracing it back through every moment of the night, the alley, the box, the walk across the street, the way I had sat down instead of turning around, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, not as a series of reactions, but as a sequence of decisions I had made one after another. "You really do see everything like that?" I said quietly, more to myself than to him, but he heard it anyway. Of course he did. "I see what people show me," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just clarity, just the simple statement of a perspective that had guided everything he had done so far. I looked at him for a long moment, the noise of the restaurant fading again, the space narrowing down to just this table, this conversation, this point where something was shifting in a way I could no longer pretend not to notice. "And what am I showing you right now?" I asked, my voice steady, because I was no longer afraid of the answer. I needed it. He did not hesitate this time. "That you are not leaving," he said, and the certainty in it did not feel like pressure anymore. It felt like recognition, like he was reflecting something back to me that I had not fully acknowledged on my own. I held his gaze, not breaking it, not looking away, because now I understood that looking away had never protected me from anything. It had only delayed the moment I had to face what I was choosing. And if I stay, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, then what changes? He leaned forward slightly again, just enough to bring the focus back to him without overwhelming the space between us. Nothing changes immediately, he said. That is the point. I frowned slightly, not out of confusion, but because that answer was not what I expected, not what I thought this moment would lead to. Then what is the point? I asked, because now I needed clarity more than ever. His gaze softened just slightly, not losing its intensity, but shifting in a way that felt more direct, more personal. That you choose it again, he said, and the simplicity of that answer landed deeper than anything else, because it removed the idea of a single decision, a single moment, and replaced it with something ongoing, something that would have to be made again and again, not once, not under pressure, but repeatedly, intentionally. I sat there in silence for a second longer, letting that settle fully, because that was the real shift, not tonight, not this dinner, but the idea that this was not about being pulled into something. It was about whether I would continue stepping forward on my own, and that realization did not feel like losing control. It felt like something else entirely, something I was only just beginning to understand. His words stayed with me longer than anything else he had said that night, not because they were complicated, but because they were not, because they stripped everything down to something I could not argue with, something I could not avoid by overthinking or deflecting, the idea that this was not about one moment, one decision, but about what I would choose again after this, and that shifted everything in a way I had not expected. I looked at him for a second longer, the quiet of the restaurant settling back in around us, the soft clink of glasses, the low conversations that had nothing to do with us, and yet it felt like none of it mattered, like this table existed slightly outside of everything else. You make it sound easy, I said, my voice steady but thoughtful, because that was the part one was still trying to understand, how something that felt so layered, so uncertain to me could seem so clear to him. He did not respond immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, like he was letting the question exist fully before answering it. It is not easy, he said finally, and there was something different in his tone now, not less controlled, but more direct, more grounded in something real rather than abstract. It is simple. I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, because that distinction mattered more than I expected it to. Those are not the same thing, I said, and for the first time, there was no edge in my voice, no need to challenge, just a statement of fact. He nodded once, acknowledging that without hesitation. No, he agreed, they are not. The silence returned again, but it felt different now, not like a pause in the conversation, but like part of it, like something we were both allowing to exist without needing to fill it. I glanced down at my hands, then back at him, and I realized something that made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from awareness. I was no longer trying to leave. That thought did not come with resistance this time. It did not come with a need to push back or prove something. It just settled quietly, like a fact I had finally stopped arguing with. You said nothing changes immediately, I said after a moment, bringing the conversation back to something I could hold on to, something that felt concrete. So what has changed? He watched me closely, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt precise, like he was paying attention to more than just my words. You do, he said, and that answer landed deeper than I expected, because it was not about him, not about what he would do or what would happen next. It was about me, about the shift that had already started and that I was only just beginning to recognize. I frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. That is very vague, I said, because it left too much open, too much undefined. A faint hint of something, not quite a smile, touched his expression. It is accurate, he replied, and there was no attempt to elaborate, no effort to explain it further, like he understood that this was something I would have to see on my own rather than be told. I leaned back slightly, my eyes drifting for a second as I let that settle, and I realized he was right in a way I could not easily dismiss. Something had already changed, not in my circumstances, not in anything visible or external, but in the way I was thinking, the way I was choosing, the way I was no longer reacting automatically, but actually considering what I wanted to do next. I looked back at him, my gaze steady now, not guarded, not defensive, just present. And you? I asked quietly, because if this was not just about me, if this was something mutual in some way, then I needed to understand where he stood in it beyond the control and certainty he carried so easily. His expression did not shift much, but there was a subtle change in his eyes, something more focused, more intentional. I observe, he said, and that answer was exactly what I should have expected, and yet it still caught my attention, because it was not passive, not detached, it was active. In a quiet way, like everything he did was built on understanding rather than impulse. I nodded slowly, because that made sense now, more than anything else had earlier in the night. Another moment of silence passed, but this time it felt settled, not waiting for something to happen, just existing as part of what this had become. I glanced at the clock on the wall without meaning to, noticing how much time had passed without it feeling like it had, and that realization brought something else with it. A subtle awareness that this evening was not going to stretch on indefinitely, that it would end, and that the ending itself would matter just as much as everything that had come before it. I looked back at him, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. So this is where it ends for tonight, I said, not as a question, but as a recognition of where we were in this moment. He held my gaze, steady as always, and nodded once. For tonight, he confirmed, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not a conclusion, not a final point, just a pause, just a place where something would continue later rather than stop entirely. I took a slow breath, letting that settle, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel the urge to rush ahead or pull back. I just felt present, aware of where I was and what I was choosing. And tomorrow? I asked, the question coming naturally now, not forced, not hesitant, just part of the flow we had fallen into. His expression remained composed, but there was something in his eyes that felt like quiet certainty, the same certainty that had been there from the beginning. That depends, he said, and there it was again, that pattern, that refusal to define anything before I chose it myself. I met his gaze, steady, no longer unsettled by it. On me, I said, not asking, just acknowledging, and he inclined his head slightly in agreement. And in that moment, I understood something clearly, something I had been circling around since the alley. This was never about whether he would come back into my life. It was about whether I would step back into his. I stood up slowly when the moment came, not because I was hesitant, but because I was aware of every small movement. The way the chair slid back quietly, the way the air shifted as I stepped away from the table, the way this felt like a closing and an opening at the same time. He stood as well, not out of obligation, but because it was part of the rhythm he moved in, controlled, deliberate, nothing wasted, nothing accidental. And for a second we stood there facing each other, the distance between us the same as it had been all night, unchanged and yet entirely different. Thank you for dinner, I said. The words simple, but they carried more weight than they normally would have, because this had not been just dinner, it had been something else entirely, something I was only beginning to understand. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without diminishing it. You are welcome, he replied, his tone steady, the same calm certainty that had never left him, and yet now it did not feel as imposing as it had before. It felt expected. I reached for my coat, slipping it on without breaking eye contact completely, because now I understood that looking away was no longer something I needed to do to protect myself. It was just another choice, and I was no longer making choices out of instinct alone. So this is where we stop, I said, more as a reflection than a question, because I already knew the answer. I could feel it in the way the night had settled, in the way nothing was being pushed further than it needed to go. For tonight, he said again, and the repetition did not feel redundant. It felt intentional, like a marker placed at a point that mattered. I nodded once, accepting that, not because I was being led to it, but because I recognized it for what it was, a pause, not an ending. I turned slightly, ready to walk toward the door, and for a second, the instinct returned, the old version of me that would have used this moment to reclaim distance, to step away and rebuild the boundaries that had been quietly shifted over the course of the evening. But I did not rush. I did not retreat. I walked at a steady pace, aware of him behind me without needing to look back, aware that nothing was chasing me, nothing, was pulling me, and that absence of pressure felt louder than anything else. The door opened before I reached it again, the same smooth motion as when I entered, and I stepped out into the night air, the coolness brushing against my skin like a reset, like a reminder that the world outside this moment still existed, still moved on its own terms. I took a few steps forward, then stopped. Not because I had to, because I chose to. I turned back. He was there, just inside the doorway, not following, not calling out, just watching in that same quiet way that had defined everything from the beginning. And for a second, the distance between us felt like a question, not his, not mine, just something that existed waiting to be answered. I held his gaze, steady, no hesitation this time, no need to prove anything. And I realized something in that moment that felt clearer than anything else had all night. This was not about whether he would come into my world again. It was about whether I would step into his, again and again, by choice, not by accident. Tomorrow, I said, the word leaving my lips before I overthought it, before I tried to shape it into something safer or more controlled. And it was not a question, not exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a continuation of something that had already begun. His expression did not change much, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper, something that confirmed what I already knew. Tomorrow, he echoed, and that was enough, more than enough, because it carried the same meaning his words always had, not a demand, not a command, but a space waiting for me to step into it. I nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate, and then I turned again, this time continuing down the street without stopping, my steps steady, my mind clear in a way it had not been before. The city moved around me, headlights passing, people walking by, everything continuing as it always did, and yet nothing felt the same, because now I understood something I had not before, something that settled into me with quiet certainty. He had not taken anything from me that night. He had not forced anything, had not closed any doors. He had simply stood there and made it impossible for me to ignore. The ones I chose to walk through.